believer must anticipate and live in an expectation of the Lord's coming. That's verses 7 and 8. We'll go back through this a verse at a time in a moment. But I think the point that James is making is that everything that happens in this life is transitory. It is not permanent. It is temporary. The things that are permanent and lasting are eternal. You live your life prepared for the second coming of Christ, and everything else is going to fall into place one way or the other. Because the most important decisions we make in life are those that prepare us for the life beyond this realm. The second thing that he, I believe, argues for in verse 9 is that believers must recognize the Lord's judgment. What follows the second coming? We know that Jesus, in the course of his ministry, had a number of parables that focused on the judgment. Paul, in particular, in his letters both to the church at Corinth and to the Romans, emphasized the universality of judgment. We will all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And in 2 Corinthians, he said, therefore, knowing the terror of the Lord, that this is a reality, judgment awaits, we persuade men. That is, we preach and teach, and our argument is judgment is coming. If you are ready, you will be fine. If you are not ready, it's over. So live your life knowing that the Lord will return, that judgment will follow, and in the context of what we face here and what we will face eternally, what awaits us with the Lord's return and judgment is so much more significant than anything that happens to us now, that we must not lose sight of what really matters. And that's our preparation for the Lord's coming and his return. In verse 10, he says, those who face difficulty, adversity, need to follow the example of the Lord's servants. And he cites a couple of examples here, the prophets, and in particular Job. And he says to the reader, when difficulties come, and they're coming, focus on the promise of the Lord's return, the judgment that is inevitably going to take place, and remember all the examples of those who've gone before who have shown us the way. And when I think about that, I in turn think about Hebrews 11. And we always think of Hebrews 11 in relationship to faith, and obviously we should, but at the same time, Hebrews 11 describes for us what faith brought about in the lives of God's servants. It led to action, and in many cases even resulted in death. But it's far better to die in Christ and be saved eternally than to die apart from Christ and be lost eternally. So he says in verse 10, you need to keep your eyes on the examples of the Lord's servants. The fourth thing he says is that believers must understand the Lord's blessings. This is the 11th verse and the first section of the verse. God really does meet our needs. He takes care of his own. This is his promise. Our difficulty is that we read that and infer from it that God gives us everything we want, and he's only promised to meet our needs, not to satisfy our desires. And when you look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, as the 6th chapter draws to a close, this is what Jesus says. You basically have three needs. You need food to fill your belly, you need clothes to cover your body, and you need a place to stay to provide shelter. Food, raiment, and shelter. And God has promised to address those needs for those who seek first the kingdom and righteousness, verse 33. I could not begin to tell you how many times I have reminded you of the psalmist who said, I was young, am now old, one thing I have not seen, the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. In the example that Jesus cited in Matthew 6, he focused on the birds of the air. God takes care of the birds. If God will take care of the birds, Jesus' responses to his listeners, don't you think he'll take care of you? In the great scheme of things, who's more important, birds or those made in his image? And you know the answer to that question as surely as I do. So rely on the Lord's blessings in times of adversity. Next, believers must realize the Lord's purpose. That's the second section of verse 11. God really does have a plan. He is in charge. We call this the providence of God. And God's plan doesn't necessarily exclude bad things. In fact, out of bad things, God can accomplish really great things. And when you think about that in context, you think about the life of Joseph, which begins in Genesis 37 and ultimately closes in Genesis 50. There's a series of really bad and tragic things that happens in Joseph's life. But out of them, God accomplished something really, really important. The preservation of the entire family, that is the children of Abraham, his descendants, who are absolutely essential if he is going ultimately to realize his vision of bringing out of Abraham's seed a Savior for the world. And he does it through Joseph and all the bad that in his life came about, that brought about ultimately, as Joseph himself said, the saving of many souls. And when he's confronted in chapter 42 with his brothers, he says, "You may have meant it for evil," that is selling me into slavery, abandoning me, telling my father that I essentially was killed by a wild animal and showing my coat dipped in animal's blood as proof so that he'll draw that conclusion. All of that was evil and bad, but he said God meant it for good. And I find nothing in Scripture to indicate that God's providence isn't at work in our lives just as he was at work in the life of Joseph. I can't point to a single example, however, but I can tell you what Romans 8:28 says, that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. So bad things happen, but out of bad things, God can bring about good. That's how we deal with adversity. And finally, in the last section of verse 11, believers must consider the Lord's character. When Jesus was upon this earth, he faced all kinds of adversity. He is the only one, as you well know, who ever lived a perfect life, never misspoke a single time, treated everyone as he would desire to be treated himself, and for it, they nailed him to a cross. He had spoken the world into existence. He could, with a word, destroy all of his enemies. But from the cross, he suffered and threatened not. It never occurred to him to turn away from his mission. He had come for the purpose of offering himself, and he would not be deterred. They spat on him, they slapped him, they beat him, they scourged him, they drove nails through his hands and feet, but he didn't revile. He suffered and threatened not. God doesn't tell us life will be easy, but he tells us how to conduct ourselves when life isn't easy, and that's to follow the Lord's example. So those are the things that I see in verses 7 through 11 as he deals again with the adversity that will befall all of us in life. And I dare say I doubt that any of it will compare with Job. Do you? Or to the Lord himself, or to great apostles like Paul, I've had people get upset at me for preaching the truth, but I've yet to be stoned. I guess it could happen. I hope it doesn't. But if it does, I would like to think I could have the courage of a Paul or Stephen. But none of us have experienced the kinds of things they experienced. The degree may vary, but the reality is a certainty. So, be patient. The word patience here is in the Greek, macro mesete. I don't like Greek because the words are all 10-cylinder pretty much. They're long and difficult to pronounce and even harder to spell. And the idea is not patience as we generally think of patience. Kids are getting on my nerves. I need to be more patient. No, that's not the idea here. This word conjures up ideas of steadfastness, which we encountered in chapter 1, being willing to endure without surrendering. It's the same word that is used, by the way, in chapter 1, verse 3, where it is translated steadfastness. It's not then long on temper. It's rather the idea of one who is not quick to surrender. A synonym for this word would be long-suffering. Life can get hard, and we need to prepare for it and stand up strong under it. So, be steadfast, long-suffering, patient brothers, meaning men and women of God, until the coming of the Lord. So there's that idea that Jesus is coming, and what keeps us motivated is the realization that he will return. And I hasten to add, not to establish a kingdom and rule over an earthly kingdom and sit on an earthly throne, but he is now King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's now reigning over his kingdom as king. And when he comes, Paul argues in 1 Corinthians 15 that he comes to receive the saints, the subjects of the kingdom, to turn the kingdom over to the Father, and then he will take his rightful place again at the right hand of the Father. He is coming. When he comes, those of us who are his subjects, who are citizens of this kingdom, are going to be delivered from all this adversity that James reminds us at the outset and at the conclusion of his letter inevitably comes into life. So if you're expecting that as you get older, life gets easier, things get better, that's not necessarily the way it works. Things will get easier and better at the return of the Lord. You just need to remember that he is calling you to be long-suffering, steadfast, in the midst of all these difficulties, so that you don't give up and surrender to Satan and thus lose out at the Lord's return. I think MacArthur, in his commentary on James, makes an interesting comment about the coming of the Lord that I will share with you just for your consideration. John MacArthur is a dispensational premillennialist, but one who is in most ways very committed to Scripture. He just tends to have a little greater commitment to Reformation theology than to New Testament theology that makes him a dispensational premillennialist, and among the masses who are expecting Jesus to set up his kingdom on earth and reign for 1,000 years. But that aside, he makes some pretty astute observations in his commentaries. And he says this, and I quote, "The more persecuted a church is, the more eagerly it anticipates the return of Jesus Christ. Conversely, an affluent, indulgent, worldly church has little interest in the Lord's return," unquote. Really easy, and everything just seems to come to us without much effort at all, it's pretty hard to stay focused on the matters that really matter. But when life is hard and things are just crumbling around us, there is tremendous benefit in reminding ourselves that this doesn't last forever. Jesus is coming again, and he will deliver us from all of this. And there are only two ways to be delivered. Either we die in the midst of it, or Jesus comes and we rise to meet him in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Other than that, we're stuck in a world where things don't always work right, where life can get hard and difficult in a hurry, and where it's so easy to give up if we lose sight of what really matters. And that's why sometimes when life comes tumbling in and folks need God more than ever, and we always need him, they blame him and walk away. And James is saying, no, you need to be steadfast. You need to have patience and endure, because he hasn't promised you that life will be easy here. He has promised you that the Lord will return, and at his return, all of this will be no more. So be patient when trials come. Remember that Jesus is going to return, and the difficulties of life will make us appreciate his coming more, and also what that coming entails. I need to stop for a moment and tell you that contrary to what most of our religious friends say, the Bible does not teach that the early church believed that Jesus was going to come shortly after his ascension. His ascension is recorded in Acts chapter 1, verse 11. On the Mount of Olives, he and his disciples are present, and he just suddenly starts to rise, and he ascends into the clouds. And two men, angels in white apparel, appear and say, "Why stand you gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus which you see taken up into heaven shall return in like manner." He went up into the clouds. He shall come into the clouds. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. Do you know there's nothing anywhere else in the Bible that talks of his return that even intimates that he will set foot on this globe again? At his coming, what the Scriptures say is that the earth and the works therein shall be burned up, seeing that all these things shall be dissolved. What manner of person ought you to be? 2 Peter chapter 3, you could begin reading in verse 8 or 9 and read through about verse 11. And you'll find that this is the ultimate fate of our globe. And its destruction will be brought about by a divine act of judgment. Not by another universal flood, but by a fire. And it will happen when God says it will happen, and not a second before. And we need to be ready for that. Because when he comes, game's over. Eternity begins, and those who have not prepared will be lost. But most of our friends out here in the denominational world still say that early Christians generally believed that Jesus' return was going to happen imminently. Well, we're 2,000 years removed from his promise of a return. And that promise in the New Testament, just in the New Testament, is either directly stated or implied in Scripture over 300 times. But none of them give any assurance that Jesus was going to come within the lifetime of those original disciples. I would point out that MacArthur says that Matthew 24 and the parallels in Mark 13 and Luke 21 all clearly describe from the lips of the Lord himself the signs that would be noted before his imminent return. Now, contrast his observation with what Jesus himself said in these same chapters relative to his return. It will be like it was in the days of Noah. Men were eating and drinking right up until the waters began to fall and the floods began to rise. Furthermore, he said, and I don't know when this will be, this coming. That's knowledge reserved exclusively to the Father, and I believe that Jesus would know now because he's now in the presence of the Father at his right hand again. But while on this earth, engaged in his ministry, he said, I don't know when that will be. What I do know is that it will be like the coming of the thief in the night. And the point that he's making is that thieves do not send out advance notice. Jesus makes that statement in Matthew 24. The Apostle Paul makes it in 1 Thessalonians 5. The Apostle Peter makes it in 2 Peter 3. And twice in Revelation, John uses the same illustration. Does that sound like there are going to be all kinds of signs to say that the return of Christ is imminent? No. And those signs that he specifically mentioned in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, are all regarding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He talks about both events. One occurred in AD 70. The other has yet to occur, and we don't know when it will occur. We just live with the understanding that it could be at any time. That's how first century Christians faced it. And as I have reminded you in the past, in those passages where the Lord is at hand, he is near. He is at our side. He has promised to be with us wherever we go, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man may do unto me. Most folks can quote Matthew 18, 15 through 18. And the argument that is made there, that whether two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst. Now, in context, he was talking about how to deal with wayward brothers. Brothers here is a generic term that means brothers or sisters, by the way. And he says, when action is required and taken, I'm there participating as well. Because he is always near his people. He's in our midst today. I can't see him. You can't see him. I don't hear his voice. You don't hear his voice. I can't reach out and touch him. Neither can you. But he's here. Can you tell me one place where he isn't? Outside of hell, no. As high as you go, God will be there. As low as you go, God will be there. Doesn't matter which direction you take off, God will be there. That's the argument, by the way, that the psalmist makes in the 139th Psalm. You cannot flee from the Lord. So when you find people saying, oh, the Lord is going to come soon, all the signs point to it, it's exactly what he said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I hope you will just stop and say, but look at what he said in context. They asked more than one question there. Most of them dealt specifically with a response to his statement, the time was coming when not one stone will be left upon another. He's talking about the temple that is at that point still under construction. Herod the Great began a great remodeling project in about 4 B.C. or slightly before that. And it didn't conclude until 65, 66 A.D. And then basically 4 years later, the Romans invade and destroy it. And that, Jesus said, one stone will not be left upon another. They couldn't believe that that would be the case. But it's exactly what happened. And the Jews, not the Romans, set that temple on fire because they didn't want it falling into the hands of the Romans. You know, we sometimes blame the Romans for burning the temple, but it was the Jews themselves that set it on fire. It was actually, filled with gold. The whole exterior of the front had gold panels on it. That stuff melted, and when it melted, it went down into the creeks and crevices. And You know what people will do for gold? They literally removed one stone from another to get to the gold. The Romans did that. They were compelled to do it because the Jews set the temple on fire so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of the Romans. That's the history behind it. Jesus said it's going to happen, and here are kinds of things that you'll see leading up to this, and then that's when he offered the signs. His second coming is like the thief in the night. There are no visible signs. So MacArthur, in that particular case, like so many others, is flat out wrong when he says that there are all kinds of signs pointing to the imminent return of Jesus. There are not, and we should have the courage of our convictions to let our friends and neighbors know that they're greatly mistaken. I think somebody may ask, can you get to heaven and believe that Jesus is going to sit on a throne and reign for 1,000 years over his earthly kingdom? Probably. You may say, how can you do that? Do you have to believe everything absolutely correctly to get to heaven? Can you be mistaken about a few things and still be saved? You better hope so. Anything that does not prevent you from doing the express will of God in terms of salvation, worship, and godly living, you can hold as a personal conviction and not impact your eternal well-being, even though it may be wrong. I think that's what Paul was arguing for in Romans 15, when he talked about some people esteeming one day above another and another esteeming every day alike. Let each be persuaded in his own mind. You can think that Friday the 13th is a special day, and you're going to set it aside and do nothing but read and pray. And you're well within your rights. There's nothing special about the 13th, good or evil. I picked that because some people think it's unlucky. That's just superstition, like walking under ladders and black cats going in front of you. That's all hocus pocus nonsense. But it's amazing to me how many people still believe that stuff. I hope you don't get caught up in it, but believe it. It's not going to keep you from heaven as long as you do what the Scriptures tell you to do to be saved and worship acceptably and live godly lives. But it's still wrong, and I think it is a disservice to people when they believe something that you know is incorrect, not to at least make the effort to inform them, to teach them the truth, so that they can grow. Further, he says, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it. Our first garden when our children were young was planted, TJ, out there in Paw Paw, just down behind our house. Orphy Vest came over with his tractor and plowed it and disked it, and Adam and I planted one evening, and the next morning, he was out of bed at the crack of dawn. He wanted to go down and see what we'd grown. Well, at that time, he was pretty young. He didn't realize that you plant and you wait. But that's the way it works. Farmers know that. They realize they don't plant one night and harvest the next. And you would think everybody would know that in terms of spiritual matters as well. But they don't always. And so the argument that he's making is that like the farmer plants and then trusts God to provide the early and late rains, we must trust God in the midst of suffering to see us through. And if you're wondering what are the early and late rains, the early rains came in, let's say the month of October. It was probably mid-October, mid-December in that area, and the later rains mid-March, mid-April, that time. And absolutely both were essential to really being successful raising a good crop. And farmers felt fortunate when the early rains fell, but they don't despair because they count on God to send the later rains as well. They just wait patiently. And he says when life has crumbled in around you, your response is to be patient and wait. To know that God will not abandon you. You may feel abandoned, but feelings are often misleading. He is still there at your side. He says, just as the farmer patiently waits throughout the entire growing season for his crop to develop, trusting God to provide everything necessary to success, Christians patiently, steadfastly endure or wait for the Lord's return and the great harvest of souls when everything is finally brought to its consummation. So I don't know when Jesus is coming. I patiently wait for his return. If he comes today, good, because it's over if you're ready, and heaven's your future. But if you're not ready, that has to be one of the most frightening things to contemplate. One's death and the second coming of the Lord ought to frighten anyone who hasn't taken proper steps to prepare. So, be steadfast, prepare your hearts for the return of the Lord, understanding that the Lord's return should not lead to speculative eschatological systems. That's a fancy word that means last things. Just listen to the Lord and his word and know he's coming. He will be like a thief. Get ready and you're going to be fine. Lord's coming is at hand is an expression, as we've already said, of the nearness of Christ at all times, and not in any way intended to say that it is going to happen in the next year or the next 10 years. When they understood the Lord's coming to be at hand, they understood that it is so certain that it's going to happen no matter what. It is so certain that it is as though it's already happened. You live your life that way, and you're going to be fine. So, just like the farmer, you be patient until the Lord returns. You're able to be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. It is so certain that it is as though it's already taken, and Christ himself is always near. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. Does that seem strange to you that he talks about being patient and enduring and focusing on the Lord's coming, just like the farmer focuses on the early and late rains? Well, have you ever listened to people when they're facing any kind of problem? I'm not talking about really major difficulties. I'm talking about minor inconveniences. What do we tend to do? Yeah, I appreciate the way you respond. We grumble. We complain. Woe is me. How can this... You know, there are just some families that live their whole lives that way. Everything that happens to them is bad. They never see the good, and the good generally far outweighs the bad. They just focus on the bad and grumble and complain. In view of the coming judgment, which is the focus here, James is telling his readers, don't grumble, which literally means to groan. An expression of, oh, not again. Poor me. Life is so unfair. Everybody else has it so easy, and it's just so hard for me. If it can go wrong, it goes wrong for me. My family it's just every day. I don't know anybody that really is accurately describing life when they focus that way on life. They're just ignoring all the good things. And they're there as well. James is essentially saying Christians must live in the midst of adversity. They must not be fretful, impatient, or seek to blame others for their distresses. This is where I think it's helpful to go back and read the first 12 verses of chapter 1. My brethren, count it all a joy when you face various trials. If you remember back to that section of our study, I suggested to you there are three words that come to mind when you talk about trials and how we deal with them. There's rage, and some people just get really angry when things don't go their way and the burdens get heavy. There's resignation. Well, it's just the way it is. I give up. I can't do anything about it. I'm not even going to try. And that's not the Christian attitude. James says we rejoice, not rage, not resignation, but rejoicing characterizes people of God in the midst of adversity. I have mentioned, and I know you won't remember this name, so I will mention it again, Alice Cunningham. You say, I never heard that name before. Diane knows Alice, knew Alice. Alice's body was absolutely racked by arthritis of the worst kind. Her fingers all went this way. She was bedfast for years. I would visit her every week, and every week walk away encouraged because she had such a wonderful attitude. Yeah, life was hard. She was just thankful to be alive. Yeah, it hurt to even move, but she knew that someday all of that would be no more. And she lived every day in anticipation of that day. I could give you other examples, but that's the one that comes to mind immediately. There was no rage, there was no resignation, there was just rejoicing. She was alive. And God had blessed her. And she would be blessed even more in eternity. Isn't that what James is saying as he wraps up this epistle? All of us aren't going to have bodies that are, deformed and overcome with pain and limited in our movements. But all of us are going to have difficulties. Don't let them destroy you. Let them make you stronger so that when the Lord comes and you stand before the judge, you will have reason to rejoice. And he says the judge is standing at the door. The idea is he's near. If somebody's at the door, that generally means that they're just on the other side, doesn't it? Waiting for the door to open and for them to be invited in. That's the picture that James closes with here in verse 9. Put your trust in the Lord. Don't grumble. Don't groan. Deal with life. God will give you the strength to do it if you'll lean on him. Jesus is always at the door waiting. Just let him in. And he uses that figure, by the way, in his letter to the church at Laodicea. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. It's a door that only opens from the inside. You've got to invite him in, but he'll never turn you down if you do. Kurt, next week we'll start with verses 10 and 11.